afternoon. It's really wonderful to see such a great audience. Then I want to offer special thanks to Peter Aaron, Maggie Aaron, Karen Maida, Allman, and Sean Cecil, who have made this possible through Elliott Bay Book Company. Thanks also to Tree Swenson and Katie Prince of Hugo House for co-sponsoring the event. Thanks for additional assistance to The Stranger and the Seattle Book Review, and to Tall Firs Productions for videotaping today's event. Now, I think every book has a secret title. And there was a filmmaker, Stan Brakhage, who always said, if you want to know the title, the real title of a book, you look at the first word of the text and the last word, put them together, and that's the real title of the book. And in that case, the title of this book would be Why End? But I think actually instead I have a better title that would be my choice for the true title of this book. And that title is Adaptation. Because Robert Cabot's life is characterized by his ability to reinvent the circumstances of his life in order to follow an evolving path. And the corollary to this is an understanding that failure to adapt is not an option, as I believe you'll see from this book. Now finally, I have a short text to read. Whereas the city of Seattle is characterized by its strong and consistent dedication to the arts, and whereas a prolific author, Robert Cabot, enthusiastically embraces Seattle's culture of artistic expression through deep reflections, honest admissions, and a hard look at who we are, and whereas Robert's extensive history of service to our country throughout World War II and in foreign service aid programs informs his writing in a way that lends a unique perspective to his work and creates an engaging experience for the reader, and whereas through his impressive and widely acclaimed works, including The Joshua Tree, That Sweetest Wine, and The Isle of Caria, Robert has established himself as one of the great novelists of our region time, and we look forward to his upcoming memoir. And whereas the preservation and proliferation of the arts lies at the core of Seattle's identity, and through talented artists like Robert, we are able to flourish as a city, and whereas the city of Seattle is proud to consider Robert Cabot a friend and ally as we work together to make Seattle more just, vibrant, and inclusive, now, therefore, I, Jenny Durkin, Mayor of Seattle, do hereby proclaim January 20th, 2019 to be Robert Cabot Day.
I gotta get to work now. Oh, God. Well, I don't know if that was an honor or not. But it's an honor to be here. And it's an honor to see all you guys. Thank you for coming. And thank you, Elliott Bay, and thank the world. Well, I was surprised to start with. Can you hear me? Before taking a look at this memoir, I'm going to read to you a list, a baker's dozen of reasons why one should resist the temptation to write a memoir. Number one, the truth gets in your way. The fact checkers with their smartphones are everywhere. Number 2, identifying oneself is a minefield. It's embarrassing. It's fraught with temptations, distortions, and particularly aggrandizements. I'm good at that. Number 3, demons of the past insist on emerging. How to deal with them. Number 4, the dark sides of real people. How to deal with them. Family, friends, and yourself. And then secrets leak out. Privacy is lost. Novel writing is more fun. It really is. That's number 6. Novel writing is more fun. It's number 7, dealing with absurdities. Many have a way of turning up as your life unfolds on the page. All those damn photos the publisher insists on. Syntax. No, I'm not going to explain about that. The arguments with your editor and your real and imagined readers. Number 11, the title. Oh, the title. And number 12, the book launchings with all those unsold books. And number 13, the last one. That's the baker's dozen. The strictures on making things up. Okay, I know that number 1 was no lies. I covered that, but one must be ready to defend oneself when mendacity wins by muttering to oneself that memory is a present event. Damn it. Does that sound familiar in the newspapers today? So that's that. Now, the book. I can't really describe the book except in a sort of general term. Let me read the first couple of pages of the prologue, because it just kind of gets you started. And in fact, the first word is why. Why now? Remembering a century, mine and my country's, America's 100 years in the sun, her brief global predominance. Those years fit loosely into the 20th century. From the vast expansion of the American empire as the Victorian century faded, to the beginning years of the 21st century, America's ascendancy seems largely finished. Her self-righteous, arrogant imperialism is fading. Her image of leadership in seeking the ideal of true democracy, of social justice, of universal human rights, of capitalism, the image is tarnished. Her assumed role as benefactor and the policeman of the world is increasingly illusory. Her destructive consumerism and reckless greed for the planet's dwindling resources are now facing their consequences and limits. Her productive genius, her supremacy in the sciences and technology are now met by effective competition. Her military might seems increasingly inappropriate when dealing with the new realities of international, intranational, and ideological conflicts, with insurgencies, terrorism, rogue nuclear threats, nuclear warfare, and overshadowing all, the approaching nightmare of global warming. So that's the sort of public, non-personal part of what goes through this book. The other part is me. I entered the America's century in 1924. World War I was over, Europe lay devastated, millions killed, hundreds of thousands of them Americans. America emerged vastly enriched, capitalism sanctified, and with a huge, growing, and largely unacknowledged empire. Me just born, gums soon sucking on a silver spoon. A silver spoon came from trade in slaves, in rum, in opium, in piracy, in ruthlessness, in hard work, entrepreneurial talent, astute marriages, lack of luck and thrift. That's where the spoon came from. And I've been living with that ever since. It's been one of the themes of my life, was feeling unworthy of that kind of privilege. The Cabots were largely Philistines and political conservative Puritans. My father and his father were industrialists, players in the immense creation of American wealth. These men's wives were generally supportive, but suppressed. Which is another theme of this book. So those two themes weave together, back and forth. What's going on in the world and what's going on with me. And it's sort of my interesting, sometimes crazy and other times, response to what's going on around me. For example, I immediately, after Pearl Harbor, I became 18 two months after Pearl Harbor, and immediately enlisted while I was a freshman in college. And I enlisted not for patriotic reasons, I enlisted to get away from my family, to get away from being at the end of puppet strings, the feeling that my life was being controlled by, particularly by my father, but also by the wealth that he'd accumulated, and that he was very puritanical and frugal about. So he was a typical sort of Bostonian, although I wouldn't call him a Brahmin. Because Brahmins to me are artistically literate, and he was not interested in art. He had an extraordinary memory, but not for art, So those are the two themes. I'm kind of at a loss where to actually begin now. Reading bits and pieces here and there, and would begin from now on, ask me questions, whatever, as we go. Anybody jump up, and I'd be glad to hear from you. And I hope you'd be glad to hear from me. During the Depression, for example, we spent every summer for a bit on a little island, very austere, not because we couldn't afford otherwise, but it was just more pleasant, which was the Puritan approach to life, I guess. Don't overdo your things in life. So we're in this very isolated little island in the Lake Winnipesaukee, and we lived without any running water. We had to pump lake water up into the kitchen. A very nice, pretty, well equipped with a Cedrola catalog, and with lots of daddy long legs. But there was also the thunder mug under the bed, if you were in a hurry. So I enlisted in the Army, and off we went to win a war. Maybe it was the only war around that, in at least recent history, that was worth it. And I think it probably was worth it, but my reasons were not patriotic, as I said, to get away from my family, and I succeeded. 4 years, mostly overseas in Africa and then Europe, and Corsica, and southern France invasion, and so forth. Let's see, let me jump through the war. You all have heard lots about that war. I had a very interesting 4 years, but not unusual. At the end of the war, as the war ended, we were given the possibility of visiting any blood relative in Switzerland. So once I said, well, I'm a blood relative. She's my aunt. She had my last name, although she wasn't a blood relative. But off I went, and there I was in this Switzerland, which was an amazing experience because you go from the mud and the horror of war suddenly into a completely opposite country. And in fact, I went across the border by train and got out from the station, and immediately a policeman came up to me and saluted me and said, "Welcome, sir." And that was the first time I'd been called sir ever. So it was an extraordinary experience. And there we were. I was being wined and dined by the American minister, which is the equivalent of an ambassador in those days, for lesser countries like Switzerland. And they had put on a party for me with Allen Dulles, who was the founder of the CIA, and a lot of generals and all kinds of people who had been having a very nice time in Switzerland throughout the war. Later I met Carl Gustav Jung, who was in Bern at the time, and my aunt was one of his many American mistresses. So there I was at this dinner, and I met, there was the minister's daughter was there, who was a gorgeous American girl, and so she accepted to have a date with me the next day. And we went around and saw the sights of Bern. And that night it was to be a dinner en famille with the minister and his family. In the middle of that dinner, somebody came in and whispered in the minister's ear, telephone book. He goes, he comes back and said, "The war is over. I just received the message that I am to transmit from Tokyo to Washington through the Swiss embassy of the surrender of the Japanese." I was right there at the time. It was extraordinary. So from that I moved to Washington. I don't need to trace my whole life in here, otherwise you don't need to buy the book.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
What was your family's response to you enlisting?
They had to agree. Until I was 21, they had to agree. And it was interesting that we had been trained as little kids to hate the war, but that war was the war that would end all wars. And that was a nice, sweet pill that most people swallowed. And we swallowed it. We were introduced to horror movies, of the horror of the two wars and the propaganda against each other. There's one thing I remember, a picture of the Kaiser Wilhelm with this sort of spearhead on the top of his helmet, and stuck on it was a British baby. And it was horrible. And on the other side, we were, I don't know, eating the Kaiser's children or something or other. There was this horrible propaganda. But at the same time, I think they realized right away that it was a war worth winning. And there was was no talk about this was a war to end all wars. But this is self-defense. We've really got to do this. It wasn't a stupid war like World War One. World War One was really stupid when you think of it. So that's my answer. You know, I don't think we've had any intelligent wars since then, mind you. But that was, it's possible, intelligent. Any other questions on this one?
I've got one here.
Yeah.
Robert, how, given that you're talking about the war to end all wars, how would you have us understand our country today where we have endless war, without strategy, without anybody seemingly involved or caring at all? How do we understand what's come over us?
Well, I have one answer to that. It's kind of just one word: beauty. Beauty. It's our only way out. Beauty. Hang on to beauty. Hang on to kindness. And if we're an extinct, about to become extinct species, which is quite possible, enjoy it. Enjoy the beauty around us, it's there. And when we run out of beauty, we run out of life. So that's kind of a abstract answer to your question.
Well, it's also hopeful.
I don't have a better one, and I do feel hopeful about it. In fact, let me turn right to the very end here. And I'd like to talk to some younger people too. We, my friends, my colleagues, my generation, my country, have left to our successors a planet in a dreadful, entangled mess, in perhaps fatal danger. A new century, new generations, it is theirs now. Our children are acutely aware of the dubious future, of the risks of hope, of hopelessness, of the imperative to seize each moment. And many are increasingly vocal, determined, liberated from the convention and hypocrisy. In them must rest hope. That sounds like the end. No, I'd love to open this to questions. I'll have some answers and often won't have any. And until they come to me, I'll thumb through a bit and see if there's something I'd like you to have particularly. There was a time when I was working in the government for various economic aid programs, and the Marshall Plan and so forth. When I was still enthusiastic, it was how to get out of the horrors of that war and move on to civilization, to some constructive and intelligent life. And we were doing what we thought was best that we could do. And some, obviously, of it was self-serving, how to make the world respond to our economic demands and our ideological demands, but also how to repair the horrors of the war, World War II, which is what the Marshall Plan was at first trying to do. But then the Cold War crept up on us. McCarthyism crept up on us. Roosevelt, my hero, FDR, even he had made mistakes, although he introduced us to sort of democratic socialism, which is, in my mind, the way we should be going. But he also tried to screw up the Supreme Court by putting in extra justices who were to his liking, which sounds familiar. But it didn't work in those days. the American people said, no, you can't mess around with the Supreme Court that way. But after several years of this, and being stationed in Thailand and Sri Lanka for a while, and watching and working in bureaucracy, the country that I came back to was not what I'd hoped any longer. And let me read a piece about that. And we're talking about 1960, something, well, no, 58, something like that. I returned to Washington in transition. The roles I was to play there, the forces that I was asked to play with, were soon to lose much of their meaning for me. Looking back now, was my return to that epicenter of the world the moment a seed of decision was planted, the ending of one mode, the beginning of quite another? Was that a pivotal moment for the world, for all of us, or just for me? 4 years as a soldier in the United States, England, Algeria, etc. A just war, if that is possible. An interlude of study, then an exciting year or two next to the White House. I worked in the executive office building for 2 years in very exotic jobs. But then 6 years in Europe and Southeast Asia, those were years when my country was offering an effective hand in saving and reshaping the world. By most standards, largely for the better. Those were years of opportunity in which I could gladly participate. And they were years that followed a decade of my childhood, my country's heroic efforts to correct the injustices and despair of the Great Depression. The Washington I returned to was a place where corrupted power, desperation, and bigotry seemed to have largely replaced the ideals that I had thought were obtainable, where willing sacrifice for those ideals was replaced by greed and consumerism, where the voices of my heroes seemed lost in a cynical snarl by the glowing dominance of corporate and military power and by fear. By the way, that reminds me of Eisenhower. Of course, he came down strongly on that last point in his farewell lecture, but the next paragraph down in that lecture was equally strong in saying that we are greedy and we're tearing our limited resources out of our planet. So there was good in that man, a lot of good. So I'd love some questions.
Robert?
Yes.
So, given your life experience, I have a question about power.
Yeah.
From your personal perspective or your experience, people in power in the United States, surely they know that unless change of some magnitude is made, that we're all in trouble, including them. I don't understand, and I've asked people like yourself, are they not aware of the consequences of the kind of choices they're making, endless war and rapacious nature? Are they not aware of this, or they just don't care? Or is it a mixture of something else, from your experience?
Well, fortunately, the people who are in the White House right now, I have no experience with.
But there are people in corporate positions and in other places in government. He's just being played, he's the puppet. But there are puppet masters. Aren't they aware that it's
Of
one
course,
time?
many of them are aware. Many of them are aware. I'm afraid many of them who act as if they're not aware are, but have somehow managed to conceal that from public view. Like most of the Republican Party, the people that are running the Republican Party, surely they realize the consequences of that. But I do think that the lust for power is almost insuperable. You can't avoid it. And it happens to all. Get into any sense of power for however short a period. It's contagious. Not really an answer to your question. I think there are some people who don't realize it. I think our president today does not realize, has no clue about the consequences of his actions.
May I share one thing to get your thoughts on this? When I was in Vietnam, I went into the service in the same as you did. I was in a helicopter with the commanding general 100%. I'd been there 6 months and I'd seen some things. I turned to the general and I said, "Why are we here?" He turned back to me and said, "Captain, war is good for business." And that's all he said. And I don't know if you've ever encountered that general. Have you?
I don't, no, I haven't. Only in the newspapers. No, I respect the American military. I think their sense of decision, their organization, their ideal of being untouchable politically is admirable. But obviously there's weaknesses, many weaknesses, and some of them are in jail right now for that. And a lot of them. Yes, Drew.
Hey, Robert. You touched on Eisenhower there a bit, and in the era of Trump, somehow I find myself being back in the 1950s. I like Ike, and that period of time, my parents were Republicans. I was quite aware of that. I remember one of the first TV shows I ever saw was the House Un-American Activities, the McCarthy things. They were the first live TV from Washington show that went on afternoon after afternoon when I was in first grade or something like that. And then Eisenhower came like a real social breath of fresh air in a sense. He was truly a Democrat and a Republican. You couldn't tell. He didn't know. He was ubiquitous in the sense of philosophy, and that seemed to be like that should be the touchstone of the Republican Party. The Eisenhower era represented something that was amenable to discussion with all sides and like that. So I was just thinking you had some personal experience maybe with the guy and what that felt like, and in retrospect, how he would have felt about our times.
Well, I never met him. I did meet Kennedy once. I almost went to work on his staff. Thank God I didn't, because I would not have agreed with a lot of what Kennedy was doing. Eisenhower had a very good side. He kept us out of a lot of wars that a lot of other presidents would have put us in. He was very weak on domestic policy, I think, and McCarthyism flourished under it. But there was something about him that was straightforward, predictable, honest. I think he was an honest man. And we treasure that as our president. Sometimes we have them, and sometimes we don't. Yes. Gabriel.
I want to thank you for sharing all your stories. I have a selection of questions for you so you can choose. I was curious about your time in Greece, the transatlantic crossing, or moments of expected or unexpected beauty in your life.
Wait, I didn't hear the last word.
Or moments of expected or unexpected beauty in your life.
Beauty.
got to the point where I don't have to look far for beauty, just look around this room. I mean, almost anything you see in this room is extraordinary. Even the architecture and the pipes up there. And somebody had to figure that out and figure out how to make them. And it's beautiful. Look at all your faces. And I think beauty is there for all of us. Greece. I mean, Greece is the Aegean Islands. I lived in the Aegean Islands for every summer for several years. And every island had been raped in a way by the Greek Navy, the ancient Greek Navy. They cut down all the trees and made boats out of them. And yet they were gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous islands. And most of what you saw was kind of made, man-made, but made through centuries and centuries. So there was a kind of continuity there of a marriage between man and nature, which is a distinction I don't like because we are nature. So is that beginning to be an answer to your question? Yes.
Can I add on to that? I'm so glad you wrote your memoirs. Most of us know you later in your life, and to learn more about your earlier life will be wonderful. But from time to time, each turn you've had, where did you get the courage to answer Gabriel's to go across the ocean, everything you've done? Where did you get the courage? What was your guiding star?
It wasn't all that big a deal.
Keep going.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, Americans are made that way. A lot of us are. And we're a curious race. Curious people thrown together with challenges. Some of the challenges are awful and destructive, and some are constructive. So I suppose life's choices can be, I wouldn't call them courageous, but maybe fortuitous, something like that.
Did you have a guiding star in each of those choices?
I've done some really stupid things in my life. Well, I'll tell you one.
Tell the story of the hike of the ranch with the workforce.
Oh, no, I'm not going to tell you. No, this is Willis Island. I had been in Canada with a friend of mine. We were canoeing down a river that had maybe never been canoed on. One of the small tributaries of the, what's it called, the Athabasca? What's the main river? It goes north. Anyhow, and it comes out of the Rockies and goes northeast. And we canoed for about 3 days, all by ourselves. It was a small tributary. And we started talking about how wonderful it is to be completely at the hands of nature. and mosquitoes, by the way. And he turned to me once, he said, you know, Rob, if we're gonna really enjoy nature, we better do it pretty soon, because we're getting older and it's not easy. So I kind of picked up on that, and I began to say, well, without really any thought, what if I just see what it would be like to choose a place and maybe just give it a little try to live alone in. So I picked a an island off the eastern coast of Newfoundland. And I found out that they had a homesteading law in that part of Canada. So I went to this island and I got a lobsterman to take me out there. We got about halfway out and he said, you know, you really, I worry about you. Do you realize that for 6 or 7 months of the year, nobody can come in or out of that island? There isn't enough ice, strong ice, to walk on or drive a car on. And there's too much ice to have a boat in. And so you're hooked there. So then we went around the island. And there was no harbor. There was no water, I mean, no lake, it was a little hill, and just trees and probably moose. So I began to wonder about this. And we went on to the next island, which still had the remnants of a fisherman's community where they built schooners out of the logs. And in every kitchen that I visited there were about 20 probably houses still occupied. Up in every kitchen there was a shelf all around the kitchen with jars, and the jars were full of moose meat. But that was the food. That was the food of this island. And they were a bit weird inbred, I would say. So I left and flew back to Rome. So you see, is that an example? Any other leading questions?
So these, your life stories are stories that you've lived with, some of them for a long time. In writing them down, did it feel like a recording and an ordering of the familiar? Or were you surprised by any fresh perspectives on your life or fresh insights? Did anything surprise you as you started writing your life down?
Well, this last episode, you know, I had to write myself out of that one. Explain it. And there's a paragraph in here that tries to explain what in hell was I doing? What was I thinking? So yeah, that was kind of a surprise. But there's, as I was saying in my introduction about how not to write a memoir, yeah, there's some strange things that unfold on the page. And you're tempted by being either too open or too modest or not too modest, or where do you stand? It's a tricky one. Novels really are a lot more fun. So buy some.
Robert?
Yes.
One last thing to mention to you. In your memoirs, I think there's some things you left out. I can speak from your relationship with the Lummi Indian tribe. For example, there are consequences of your appearing in their world that made a huge difference, all positive. And had you and Penny not been in the picture, they would not have happened. I can say that out of any question. So sadly, I think, I wish you'd been writing this, because there's some appreciative moments that are over the horizon of your memory that directly relate to the fact that you appeared in their community.
Well, you know, most of the thanks to that goes to Penny. Maybe all of it. I tagged along. No, Penny has been, the second half of my life has been the center of my life. Absolutely the center. Without her, this memoir would never have been written.
No, I bullied you.
Yeah, and she was horrified when it was going to go public because of this guy. He was going to be just a private mimeograph kind of thing.
Sorry.
No, special with Bruce. Thank you, Bruce, for what you put into this. And
It's a great pleasure.
you've also been faithful to my novels. I'm glad you dug up the Joshua Tree again, too. Thank you. Yes?
Rob, how long did you spend working on this and what was your writing process like?
10 years. No, I started writing this in Mexico off and on. I was writing a novel at the same time, The Isle of Korea. And every now and then I'd go back and forth between these two. A lot of laziness and sloth was involved.
Damn, why am I writing this book?
No, I'm glad to have written it. I'm really glad. And it's one way, I guess I've chosen to get some of my thoughts out to the world, and I hope my novels have done some of that too. More questions? Yes. Yes, yeah.
Given that you've had such a long, beautiful, and varied life, I'm curious what you'd say to someone in their 30s, given all the problems in the world and all the quest of finding oneself and all the different paths one could take in love and family and saving the world and all these myriad of problems. What is your advice on giving direction? What's most important? Which paths to take?
Yeah, well, I usually use the word beauty in this sort of more condensed form. I would use the word kindness. Be kind. Start local, be kind. We can all be kind to each other. It might spread, it might save us. It's worth trying, and it's a lot of fun. To be kind is much more fun than not be kind.
Did you have a question that sort of guided your travels? You were trying to answer, it just evolves.
Be yourself. Be yourself. That's best I can do. Yes. Hi.
Given your life experiences and your rejection at first of your family, what is your relationship with the Cabot family?
That's a tough one. It's okay. In some cases, I'm that goddamn tree hugger, bunny lover, vegetarian, all kinds of negative things like that. But I think there's also considerable feeling among my siblings, for example. I have 2 brothers and a sister left, and one brother who died, who have always said, at least, that they admire my rebellions and wish there were more. Something like that. But I'm definitely a black sheep in the eyes of much of my Cabot family. My mother's side was very different. My mother's last name was Wellington, which sounds very important. However, their ancestors were farmers in a little town somewhere in the south part of England, called Wellington, which happened to be the name that General Wesley, who won the war, the Napoleonic Wars for England, he chose Wesley because his parents owned a piece of it. and he only visited it once in his life. So my mother's family were very different from the Cabots. They were very gentle, kind. They were not self-aggrandizing ever. They were certainly tolerant, far more tolerant than the run-of-the-mill Cabot. They were lovely people, and they were not ambitious in the same way. They were not great entrepreneurs. They managed to do all right. They were comfortable. They didn't need to go any further. So it was a mixture of things. Yes.
Do you think there's any hope in the near future for our country to turn in a better way?
Yes. Yes, I do. I think there's a person absent today in this meeting because she's very ill, temporarily. Pramila Jayapal. She was to have been here. She's a very dear, long-term friend of ours. There's hope. The people like her are around, and more of them now. There's a flood of women who God help them. If they manage to get rid of some of the negative stuff that's going on in Washington, more power to them, and I think there is hope that they can.